Hi, I'm Hilda Rodriguez. I teach in women's and gender studies and political science, and sometimes I pop up in other departments too. And today I'm going to talk about, maybe for 4 minutes, I'm not really sure how long this is going to go really, about some of the things that I am interested about in both my research and my teaching, which have to do with some of the ways in which we in the West in particular tend to not think about or to minimize ways of understanding that are non-Western or that come from other traditions and cultures. So there are ways in which we tend to valorize ways of viewing the world that we deem modern or Eurocentric or Western, just because they are so, even sometimes without really realizing it. Whereas non-Western forms of knowledge, sometimes we don't even really classify as knowledge, and we tend to view them as pre-modern and therefore lesser than, and sometimes even backwards or primitive. So this is something that I'm interested in general. In fact, a lot of my work is about citizenship and the ways in which we tend to view citizenship in a very narrow way, and that there are forms of political belonging and membership that are not the model that we have in the nation state, in the Western model of nation state, and that also do not come from the Greek model of citizenship, from the ancient Greek model of citizenship that are valid. But today I want to talk about the way in which we think about gender and sexuality specifically. And in thinking about all of these things, I'm really influenced by Latin American theorists of what they call coloniality of power, which basically argues that even though colonialism might have ended, coloniality as a force continues. So coloniality of power is the way in which the forces of colonialism still operate in thinking, making us think that whatever is modern is what is Western and European, and whatever is pre-modern and not European is backwards and not as important. So one of these theorists, Maria Lugones, who works in the US but is from Argentina originally, she argues that gender itself is an introduction of colonialism, and that the system by which we organize ourselves into genders is a racialized system that is created by colonialism, and that in fact we wouldn't have gender without coloniality. That's an argument that I'm not going to go into, but what I want to talk about is the fact that we might think that, we in the West are progressive because we have conceptions of queerness and growing acceptance of, we tend to call LGBTQ and different formulations of this, and we have in the mainstream a growing awareness of trans and queer issues. But in fact there are different ways of thinking about this in quote-unquote primitive pre-modern cultures and societies. So this false dichotomy of those backward people and we in the West who are so progressive is one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about in my work and teaching. So often people think about the idea of a third gender in other cultures, which is not quite accurate, but often people have heard of this term. They will say, oh, well, Native Americans have a third gender, two-spirit people. That's not quite an accurate term, but let's go with it for now. truth is that in many Native American cultures, there are configurations of community that do not look like the binary system of gender that we tend to have in the West. And people, regardless of their anatomy, occupy roles that are neither that of man or woman. Today, Two-Spirit, since 1989, occupies a sort of umbrella term function. In 1989, a bunch of Native American activists and communities got together and decided that Two-Spirit would be the umbrella term that they would use to talk about the many different terms that different communities use to talk about roles that people fill in communities that are neither those of man and woman. And this can take many different forms. For example, in the Navajo Nation, the word, which I'm not going to try to botch the Navajo, is the one who is transformed. That's what it means. And it means that that person fulfills a particular role in the community that is different from the role that women in the community perform and that men in the community perform. In the Cherokee Nation, there's not an exact translation, but the word is something like strange-hearted. And traditionally, Two-Spirit people among the Cherokee were healers, and they occupied a particular role. And when people ask, well, is Two-Spirit a gender identity, sexual orientation? Both and neither. It's a particular role that people fulfill, and it can have to do with both the sexuality that people express, but it really has to do with the role that people occupy in the community, and in that sense it has more to do with the gender identity of people. Because of the work that I do, which has to do with indigenous people that originate in southern Mexico, I'm much more familiar with the kind of manifestations of non-normative, from the perspective of West, gender in southern Mexico and among Zapota communities in particular. In the city of Juchitán in Oaxaca in southern Mexico, the sort of arrangement in that particular community is such that there are men, women, and mushe. Mushe generally are people who are assigned male at birth, but at a certain point in their lives they begin to dress in what is typically considered to be feminine dress. But that does not mean that they're viewed as either women or as gay or homosexual. And there's a discourse of homosexuality in the community, and generally people who are considered gay are not accepted in the community, but mushe very much have a role in the community, even though they are assigned male at birth, but at a certain point they are considered mushe. They dress in the same kind of garments that women wear, but they acquire a different role in the community. They perform a lot of the activities that women do as well, and they might engage in sexual activity with men, but they generally don't get married, for example. And they occupy a particular role. For example, they are the ones who tend to take care of the elderly. So in thinking about these arrangements of gender and sexuality, which are not necessarily called that in other communities, we can think of the ways in which we tend to have very narrow conception of gender and sexuality in the West. And even when we think, oh, well, today we are opening up our minds and thinking about that gender and sexuality in a much less narrow way, there are examples in cultures that we tend to think of as, in the decline or primitive, pre-modern, that have a lot to teach us about not being rigid and binary in the way in which we conceive of gender and sexuality. And I think we need to really think about what it means to consider seriously the knowledge that all those cultures have to offer. Thanks.